Greetings, class. Good afternoon, and welcome to the third lecture presentation for the Philosophy and Religion course. My name is Andrew Bridges. For this week, as well as the next week, we will be focusing on the problem of evil and how this relates to concepts of God. This particular lecture will be on theodicy, its origin, as well as the many different forms it takes, and some criticisms of theodicy. I prepared a PowerPoint, which I will share with you now. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, this presentation will be on the concept of theodicy. Here is a brief outline. So first we're going to go over the definition of the term theodicy, and then we'll go over the divisions of the term evil. So what different types of evil are there and how does that relate to theodicy? We'll go over the origin of the term theodicy, which is from Leibniz, and we'll consider objections to Leibniz theodicy, particularly in the work Candide by Voltaire. We'll look at various other types of theodicies. Leibniz had a particular type of theodicy. And then we'll lastly look at atheism and different concepts of God resulting from the lack of a viable theodicy. Okay, so the concept of theodicy, or the definition of theodicy, involves a particular concept of God. This is a God which is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. So these will be the concepts, the qualities of this concept of God, in which theodicy is concerned. The philosophical problem can be expressed this way. If God is all-powerful, then God could prevent evil. If God is all-knowing, then God would know evil is going to happen. And if God is perfectly good, then God would want to stop evil from happening. Therefore, the question is, why does evil happen? So the answer to that question, a justifiable answer, which means a compelling answer, that includes all of those qualities of God and acknowledges evil, is what a theodicy is. So said a different way, a theodicy is a justification for an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God, given the concept of evil, given the problem of evil. Evil is often divided into two different forms. There's moral evil, and that's the evil that human beings commit against one another: war, murder, various forms of violence. And then there's a concept called natural evil. And natural evil is destruction or injury that occurs to people as a result of natural disasters, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes. We can see how this might apply to attempts at theodicy, particularly if we say, well, the reason that there's evil given the all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God is that God grants us free will, for example. This would be one of the types of theodicies. And this might work for moral evil, right? So God yields some power to human beings, hoping that they don't commit violence, but God won't physically stop them because that would violate free will. That might be one way of looking at it. But then we say, well, what about these natural evils, right? If God is all powerful, God could stop these disasters from happening. Why does God not do that? So when we think about evil, we want to think about the multiple dimensions of it, given the concept of God. And again, we're relating what might be considered evil, given the concept of God. A natural disaster in contemporary scientific paradigms just is a natural disaster. We don't necessarily ask why philosophically. Right? But if we're thinking about natural disasters, given this concept of God, then that could be an open philosophical question. So the term theodicy was coined by Leibniz in his book, which is entitled Theodicy. It's in Latin, but it's Theodicy, and it was published in 1910. And if we look at it in the Latin, so an essay on theodicy for the goodness of God, the liberty of humans, and the origin of evil. So in this work, Leibniz proposes a theodicy. Well, first, the concept itself is explained, but then Leibniz will state his own theodicy. And Leibniz argued in his book Theodicy that the world we experience is the best of all possible worlds, and that although there is evil in this world, all other possible worlds would contain even more evil. and therefore God should be praised for giving us the best of all possible worlds, right? And this became a popular idea. The idea is such that God imagined all possible worlds, all possible scenarios, trying to maximize all of human freedom and goodness, taking into consideration everything. And this was the best of all possible worlds. All other worlds would be worse. It's not clear how intuitive this is, but it is a formal explanation for why there is evil and why God is all powerful. This is all powerful, all knowing, and perfectly good. This is simply the best that it could be. Although this theodicy was popularized during Leibniz's time, which it was written in 1710, it was deeply challenged after the Lisbon earthquake and the tragedy which the earthquake caused. And to give some statistics on that. So here's an artist rendering of the city after the earthquake, then after the flood and fire that came next. And this was the rendering of how the city looked prior to that. This happened, and if we have in mind this idea of best of all possible worlds, this earthquake and the timing was quite counterintuitive. For example, it happened on All Saints' Day, which was November 1st. Much of the population was assembled in churches praying to God during that time. It was considered a holy day of obligation. So they were in the churches praying to God. At around 10 a.m., an earthquake, which was calculated at about an 8.6 to 8.8 magnitude, happened. The city collapsed. All these people praising God were suddenly crushed by the cathedrals and buildings themselves. And the estimated death toll was roughly 60 to 100,000, and the city was left in ruins. And so the idea that this would be the best of all possible worlds was quite counterintuitive. And here's an important point to note. Although theodicies can be theoretical in nature, they have to be able to acknowledge the particular evils of the time, the very significant and varieties of evils, and they have to be able to account for this. And an evil such as this, a natural disaster with the timing just seemed quite bizarre, and many people became critical of this theodicy, of this best of all possible worlds theodicy. In another sense, we might also argue to what sense does it lack falsifiability? If any horrific evil can happen, and we're still saying this is the best of all possible worlds, then how could this idea possibly be falsifiable? And so this tragic event seems to provide counter evidence to this idea of best of all possible worlds. The idea from Leibniz was probably most harshly criticized by philosopher Voltaire in his work Candide, in which Voltaire essentially tries to, through a novel, a story, show that this might be, in essence, the worst of all possible worlds, the worst one can imagine. And Candide definitely sort of takes up that idea of showing that this is not the best of all possible worlds. But in many circumstances, like the Lisbon earthquake, it might be up there with possibly the worst thing that could possibly happen. Right, and this was in right after the earthquake in 1757, and yeah, this is some quotes from the work Candide, again, sort of targeting Leibniz. If this is the best of all possible worlds, and what then are the others, right? So if we imagine what happened in Lisbon at the earthquake, we're calling that the best of all possible worlds, then how must the other worlds look? So that's more sarcastic, right? And then again, just thinking about all the negative and harsh realities that people endure, it is spoken and ask each passenger to tell his story. They're on a boat, and if there is one of them all who has not cursed his existence many times and said to himself over and over again that he was the most miserable man, I give you permission to throw me headfirst into the sea. So again, just sort of acknowledging this idea that life is not always the best, but not only is it not always the best, but just there can be quite a much or quite a large amount of misery in people's lives that just is continuous unto death, right? So miserable life, harsh death, with very little enjoyment in between. So this is the type of scenarios that Voltaire is describing, and it makes this idea of Leibniz's best possible world, theodicy, it decreases the cogency of it. Here's another quote from Voltaire, but this is simply to sort of also get at the earlier ideas of the world being rendered according to design, right? If we think of the argument from design, this was another aspect that Voltaire was very skeptical of. So this, again, this quote illustrates that the world was not designed. Any design that we might think is in the world is imposed by human beings. And when these huge natural disasters occur, the design is shown to have no real design at all. So this was just the best of all possible world theodicies, was just one of many theodicies. Theodicies can appeal to any number of things. I want to go over some of the things which theodicies appeal to. Many of them were taken out of the third chapter of the philosophical introductory text, The Big Questions. There's a section on it labeled Theodicy, and they give quite a few different theodicies, right? So I will just go over a few of them. And so this is for, again, where the person, usually a theologian or a philosopher, who is attempting to justify the all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God, given the problem of evil. These are some ways in which the literature has attempted to do that over time. So the first one is to deny evil as real, not the experience of evil. Obviously, the experience of evil is real, but, and this is more with St. Augustine, for example, to say that evil is a privation of good, to say that evil lacks substantial existence, but is really only the diminishment of good, right? So death is only the absence of life. It's nothing added to the world. It's simply when the good ceases to exist or exists in a lesser fashion, right? And St. Augustine would give examples as the moon is not evil, it's just less light than the sun. And he would make analogies such as that. So the degree to which this is compelling, particularly for all forms of evils, is quite debatable, but this was one of the approaches in which to deny evil as real in a substance, right? Even though the experience of evil is obviously real. The second would be some type of dualism, right? And so this would essentially think of aspects in maybe a dual world, right? There is this world in which something is evil, but there is another world in which it is understood differently, or perhaps there's some type of good being produced from it, right? And this will definitely dovetail into other aspects. Just deserts, essentially this would say that evil would be a punishment for something that someone did, not necessarily even the person who did the evil, but someone is being punished for an evil being committed. And so there is justice, but in this, we might say, bizarre way. Deferred compensations. This could also be seen as in this world, many times good people suffer and wicked people or people that commit evil are rewarded or don't suffer. But in a next life, in an afterlife, the good people will be rewarded for their goodness and the evil people will be punished, right? So this type of theodicy would attempt to justify it this way, saying, for example, that that although in this world all of these things seem completely unfair, in a next world it'll be balanced out, right? And many philosophers have reflected on this in the sense that some philosophers, Hume and Kant, will say it seems like there is much more evil than good in the world, much more suffering than joy. Others will reflect on the idea that sometimes people, according to the laws and codes of their time, are very good, we might say righteous human beings, ethical human beings, and yet they suffer all these evils. Whereas people who on all accounts are evil and inflict much suffering on others, they may not, they go unpunished and perhaps live a very comfortable life. And so what do we make of this? What do we make of this if there is this all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God? What do we make of this idea of justice if the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer? This would say that, well, in the next life, all of the rewards and punishments will be given to those. So we do the deferred compensation, divine pedagogy, or maybe somehow we learn something from this. And this can also be understood as the ascetic solution in the idea that without a certain amount of evil, we might not necessarily appreciate the good. Other theologians such as, and philosophers, John Hick, thought about it as a soul-making theodicy, whereas through the experience of evil, we learn and we grow. This, again, is all of these solutions are highly debatable, and their merit is again highly debatable. We might ask, well, again, we do learn quite a bit from contrast, from good and evil, maybe a little bit of suffering, a little bit of struggle, but why so much? It would be a reply. Or what about the people who don't learn anything from it? When in the next week's lecture, when we look at the book of Job, perhaps Job learned from his suffering, but part of his suffering was that all of his children died, and they didn't seem to perhaps learn anything. So when we think about divine pedagogy, we usually have a protagonist or a few protagonists in mind, and then we also have a bunch of what we might call expendable people who suffer and die, but they might not learn anything. It's just the other people might, but this might be something to consider. Free will. Again, I went over free will a bit in the slide with moral evil and natural evil. Free will might work well for moral evil. It works less well for natural evil, particularly in this paradigm of the all-powerful, all-knowing and perfectly good God. Again, also one of the things to realize and philosophically is if we appeal to free will, this immediately opens up another philosophical argument, is do we have free will? And then so we see how one philosophical problem, the problem of evil, and then the solution of free will, then opens up another philosophical discussion, that being, do we have free will? And if we have free will, then what is our concept of God? So for example, if God knows everything, then God knows the decisions we're going to make. Then the decisions we're going to make can be said to be predestined. And then how does that work with free will? So what concept of free will do we have? So another important point is to see how things are connected. Vicarious atonement. This could be similar to just deserts, especially if someone else is punished for the wrongdoings of someone. So someone else is being punished or atoning for another individual's wrongs, right? And then finally, appeal to mystery. And this is not necessarily an answer, as opposed to saying that our epistemological situation or our source of knowledge is limited such that we cannot explain this dynamic of the all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God and evil coexisting, right? This might be beyond the human epistemological limits, and this is the appeal to mystery aspect. So these are just some of the theodicies or the approaches to theodicies. I hope I've given a brief description of each, as well as a clear brief description of each, as well as at least one counter argument for each. And so similarly with the arguments for the existence or non-existence of God, we have a similar thing going on here with the existence of a certain type of God, the all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God, and the idea of evil. And so we're looking at how can we keep this concept philosophically and supply justification for it, given the problem of evil. And so philosophy goes a different step. In a devotional understanding, a person who is devoted to a particular religion or particular type of God might just say they believe it on faith. This is quite fascinating. But philosophically, we want to perhaps move beyond that and try to provide rational argument for the concept of God or the reason why. Right. So we want to go further and evaluate it in a philosophical way. Right. Lastly, atheism in the context of theodicy. So all of those former approaches wanted to keep the concept of God as all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, and acknowledge that the experience of evil was real, and then to provide justification. Now, some philosophers and theologians find that that can't be done. There isn't a viable theodicy. Again, in our discussions, we'll go ahead and debate this as a class. But another solution might be that one could conclude that there's no viable theodicy and that evil exists, and therefore God must not be all-powerful, all-knowing, or perfectly good. Now, this could result in two things. One could be that you deny one of these aspects of God, and this could result in a different concept of God. So you might say, well, God is all-powerful and God is all-knowing, but God is not concerned with human beings. God created the world and then stepped away. That is more of a deistic model. And therefore, the problem of theodicy is no longer a problem, right? So you could take away one of these three qualities of God, then get yourself a different concept of God, and therefore solve theodicy that way. Not solve it in the sense because you're sort of changing the rules of the theodicy, but you could say, okay, God is not one of these three things, but then God is still the others, right? The other thing, though, is if you do not think there's a viable theodicy, but you're also committed to the concept of God as all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, right? So you say if God wasn't all three of those things, then God would not be God. That may result in atheism, right? Saying, okay, well, this concept of God is a concept, and this experience of evil is real. And therefore, I can't justify the existence of this concept, and it might result in atheism. So saying that one of the aspects is not real could result in a different concept of God. It could result in a disbelief in that type of God, and then therefore a disbelief in God. All of these are possible outcomes for discussing theodicy. So I hope you all found this lecture presentation helpful. Definitely afterwards be able to understand the concept of theodicy, understand the origins of theodicy, understand the different approaches to theodicy and their criticism, and also understand that at the end, you can select a viable theodicy, modify the concept of God, or not believe in the concept of God. All of those are possible philosophical options. In the next lecture presentation 4, we will go over the concept of anti-theodicy. And this is different from atheism, right? They're not the same thing. Anti-theodicy acknowledges the concept of God and acknowledges the presence of evil, but does not attempt to justify God. Instead, the anti-theodicy more expresses confusion or pain over evil. They sort of existentially acknowledge the evil, but they don't seek to justify it, right? And we're going to also look at the Hebrew Bible book of Job as possibly a model in a certain sense for anti-theodicy as well as theodicy. So this will be the next lecture presentation. I hope this was helpful. Take care.